I was assigned to Cathedral Administrative Services when I was 19 standard years old. The appointment came with modest pride. My father had worked the Promethium refineries in the lower stacks, and here I was, processing devotional records in the upper Hive's ecclesiastical district. The office smelled like parchment and sealing wax. I remember that specifically. The wax was red, imperial red, and we used it on every blessed document that passed through our hands. My supervisor's name was Administratum Adjunct Kelvin, and he taught me how to verify the authenticity of devotional tithes with a specific pattern of stamps. 3 strikes, pause, 2 strikes. The rhythm mattered, he said. Precision was prayer. The cathedral I served was officially designated Cathedral 17 of the High Sanctum District, though everyone called it the Ascension Basilica. It rose 47 levels from its foundation, with stained glass viewports that caught Hive Primus's artificial sunlight during the 8-hour illumination cycle. I attended services there every 7th day, as required. The rituals followed standard ministorum pattern, recitation of the Imperial Creed, hymns in Gothic, benedictions delivered by priests in black cassocks. The benches were stone. They were uncomfortable by design, I think. Comfort was not the purpose of worship. I processed tithe records for 3 years before anything changed. The numbers told stories if you looked long enough at them. Attendance rates, donation volumes, requests for benediction. Cathedral 17's metrics were declining. Not dramatically, a 0.3% reduction in attendance year over year, a 0.7% decrease in voluntary donations. The ecclesiarch cardinal responsible for our district was a man named Verentius. I never met him directly, but his signed orders crossed my desk regularly. He noticed the decline. The memorandum he issued was dated 127, M41, local calendar designation. I archived the original. The memorandum's language was careful. It referenced the Emperor's glory and humanity's duty to recognize that glory appropriately. It suggested that perhaps our devotional presentations had become, the word used was, insufficient. Not in theological content, but in emotional impact. The Emperor represented ultimate perfection, the memorandum stated. Should not our worship reflect the magnificence of what we venerated? Should not our cathedrals inspire awe that matched the scale of his sacrifice? The first change was subtle. The ecclesiarchy commissioned new artwork for the cathedral's main apse. The old mosaic depicted the emperor enthroned, rendered in standard iconographic style. Golden armor, severe expression, the aquila prominent. The new piece covered the same wall space but used different techniques. Real gold leaf. Crystalline inlays that caught the light. The emperor's face was rendered with extraordinary detail, each feature perfect, balanced, beautiful in a way that made you want to keep looking. The armor was elaborated with patterns that suggested both strength and elegance. It was stunning. I remember standing in the nave after its installation, staring upward, and feeling something I had not felt during services before. Not just duty, something closer to desire, the desire to be near something so perfect. Attendance increased 0.8% in the following quarter. Donations rose 1.2%. The data was clear. Cardinal Verentius commissioned more artwork, statuary flanking the main processional. Saints and heroes rendered in white marble with unprecedented anatomical precision. Their faces were beautiful. Their poses suggested devotion but also movement, grace, an aesthetic appeal that standard imperial iconography did not typically pursue. The stations of the emperor's mythology, his unification of Terra, his creation of the Primarchs, his enthronement upon the golden throne, were depicted in new frescoes that emphasized not just the events, but the visual splendor of them. Colors that made you feel something watching them. Compositions that drew your eye and held it. I was 24 when they revised the liturgical music. The old hymns were chants, rhythmic, repetitive, functional. The new compositions incorporated instruments, strings, bells with specific tonal qualities. The choir was expanded and trained in harmonic techniques I had no technical knowledge of, but I could hear the effect. The music did not just accompany worship, it created atmosphere. During the hymn of ascension, the notes seemed to lift physically upward, pulling something in your chest with them. People closed their eyes during services now, not in boredom, in transportation. The changes accelerated. Incense was introduced, not the standard devotional grade, but mixtures with specific aromatic properties. Rose and sandalwood, and something else I could not identify, something that made the air feel thick and warm. The priest's vestments were redesigned. Still liturgically correct, still bearing appropriate symbols, but cut from finer fabrics, dyed in richer colors, deep crimsons and purples and golds that caught the candlelight. The effect was not ostentation. It was beauty in service of devotion. That was how it was explained. That was how it felt. Attendance rose 7%. Donations increased 12%. The waiting list for baptisms and marriages extended 16 months. I met Davin in year 6 of the transformation. He was assigned to the Ecclesiarchy's architectural planning office, working on the cathedral expansion projects. He was 31, 8 years older than I was, with dark hair that he kept slightly longer than standard administrative length. He wore his administrative robes with the cuffs folded back, exposing his forearms when he worked. I noticed that detail. I noticed him. We began taking recaf together during duty breaks. The recaf was still bitter, still standard issue, but the conversations made it taste less harsh. Davin was excited about the expansion. The Ecclesiarchy was adding new wings to Cathedral 17. Chapels dedicated to specific aspects of imperial devotion. The Chapel of Glorious Sacrifice. The Chapel of Transcendent Victory, the Chapel of Eternal Beauty. That last one was new terminology. Beauty as a theological category. Davin explained it to me over recaf in the administrative refectory, gesturing with his hands as he spoke. The emperor represented ultimate perfection, yes, and perfection was, by definition, beautiful. Therefore, pursuing beauty was pursuing the emperor's nature. Worshipping beauty was worshipping him. The logic felt sound. I remember nodding. I remember agreeing. The Chapel of Eternal Beauty was completed in year 8. I attended the consecration ceremony. The space was smaller than the main cathedral, more intimate. The walls were paneled in dark wood, carved with patterns that seemed to flow into one another. The lighting was indirect, creating a warm amber glow. The central focus was a sculpture, the Emperor, but rendered differently than I had seen before. Still recognizable, still bearing appropriate symbols, but the body was idealized beyond mere heroism, into something approaching the classical aesthetic. Perfect proportion, perfect symmetry, beauty that transcended function. The face was rapturous. That was the word that came to mind, rapture, ecstasy in service of humanity. Services in the chapel were different. More experimental, the priest said. The liturgy incorporated periods of silence where worshippers were encouraged to meditate on beauty, to open themselves to transcendent experience, to feel the emperor's perfection rather than merely recite it. Music played during these periods, wordless, flowing, designed to facilitate emotional ascension. The incense was stronger. People wept during services, not from sorrow, from being overwhelmed. I saw it. I felt it myself during one service, tears running down my face while I stared at the sculpture, feeling something vast and warm and beautiful pressing against my consciousness. Davin attended services with me. We began going weekly, then twice weekly. The chapel offered evening services that were less formal than the main cathedral's rituals. Gatherings where the priests encouraged worshippers to share their experiences of encountering the emperor's perfection. People spoke about moments of transcendence, about feeling connected to something vast, about the beauty of devotion, Davin shared once. He talked about architecture, about creating spaces that elevated the human spirit, about how his work designing these chapels felt like the most meaningful thing he had ever done. His voice broke slightly when he spoke. I reached over and took his hand. No one commented. Physical expressions of brotherly affection were increasingly common in these services. We were all connected through devotion. The ecclesiarchy began training specialists in what they termed aesthetic devotion. Priests who studied not just theology but art, music, sensory experience. They developed new liturgical frameworks. Services became performances, not in the sense of falseness, but in the sense of artistry. Every element was designed for maximum emotional and spiritual impact. The processions incorporated dancers, male acolytes trained in movement that expressed devotion through physical grace. The prayers were set to music. The homilies were delivered with theatrical timing, the priests' voices rising and falling in patterns that gripped your attention. It was working. Cathedral 17 became the most attended worship site in the district, then in the sector, then in the entire Hive spire. People traveled from lower levels to attend our services. The waiting times for entry to major ceremonies extended to hours. The ecclesiarchy expanded the complex again and again. By year 15, the Cathedral 17 complex covered 42 city blocks and employed a staff of 3,000. I had been promoted twice. I was supervising a department of 18 administrators, processing the overwhelming volume of devotional documentation the expanded operations generated. Davin and I moved into shared habitation in year 12. It was practical. We both worked long hours in the cathedral complex, and the staff housing was significantly closer than our separate quarters had been. The apartment was modest, but located in a good section of the upper Hive. We could see 3 of the cathedral spires from our window. We attended services together 4 times per week. We were both deeply involved in the community of worshippers that had formed around the aesthetic devotion movement. We were happy. That is not a word I use casually. I was happy. The theology continued evolving. The priests, now called aesthetic celebrants, in internal documentation, developed concepts around the idea of experiencing the divine rather than simply acknowledging it. The emperor was not distant, they taught. His perfection could be felt, touched, experienced in moments of transcendent beauty. Worship was not rote recitation, but active pursuit of these moments. Services became longer, more immersive. The evening ceremonies in the expanded chapel complex ran 4 hours, 5 hours. Time became difficult to track inside the chapels. The incense, the music, the visual stimulation, the communal energy, it all blurred together into a continuous experience of escalating intensity. The artwork became more elaborate, more sensual. That was a word that appeared in the aesthetic celebrants' theological texts. Sensual, engaging the senses in service of the divine. The sculptures depicted not just the emperor but his followers in states of devotional ecstasy. Beautiful male forms rendered with absolute anatomical precision, faces upturned in rapture. The paintings showed devotional scenes, the emperor's victories, yes, but composed like classical masterworks, emphasizing the beauty of the subjects, the drama of the lighting, the emotional intensity. Some depicted the emperor receiving worship, surrounded by beautiful figures, in various states of elaborate dress or artistic undress, their bodies serving as visual metaphors for humanity, offering everything to the divine. I remember standing before one such painting in year 18. It showed the emperor enthroned, while around him, worshippers in various poses of devotion, reaching upward, heads thrown back in ecstasy, bodies arranged in compositionally perfect patterns. The painting was enormous, covering an entire wall of the processional gallery. I stood there for 20 minutes, unable to look away. The beauty was overwhelming. It hurt slightly. A good hurt. The hurt of encountering something too perfect for your ordinary consciousness to contain. Davin stood beside me. His hand found mine. We did not speak. There was nothing to say. We were experiencing the emperor's perfection together, and that was enough. The Inquisition investigation began in year 27. I did not know it was happening initially. Inquisitorial operations are, by design, opaque to external observation. The first indication I had was Davin mentioning that some off-worlders had been attending services. Ecclesiarchy officials from other sectors, he thought, come to observe our successful devotional methods. That was plausible. We had delegations visiting regularly. Cathedral 17 had become famous across the subsector as a center of passionate, successful imperial worship. The off-worlders attended services for 3 weeks. They took notes. They interviewed worshippers leaving ceremonies. I was interviewed once, briefly. A woman in grey robes with a servo skull hovering at her shoulder. She asked me how long I had worshipped at Cathedral 17, what attracted me to the services, how I would describe my devotional practice. I told her the truth. I had worshipped here for 27 years. I was attracted to the beauty and the sense of connecting with something vast and perfect. My devotional practice centered on aesthetic experience as a pathway to understanding the Emperor's glory. She thanked me and moved on. Davin was interviewed more extensively. His architectural work meant he had detailed knowledge of the complex's design, the theological concepts embedded in its structure. He came home from that interview energized. He had spent 2 hours explaining the sacred geometry incorporated into the Chapel of Eternal Beauty's proportions, the way the acoustic properties were designed to enhance musical transcendence, the symbolic meaning in the processional path's layout. The investigators had asked excellent questions, he said. They clearly understood sophisticated theological architecture. The arrests began 4 days later. I was at my desk when the Arbites arrived. Arbites' presence in the cathedral complex was not unusual. They provided security for major ceremonies, but these Arbites moved with purpose. 6 of them entered the administrative wing in full combat gear. Shock mauls active. They went directly to Cardinal Verentius's office. I watched from my desk as they escorted him out in restraints. His face was confused. He kept saying something about clearance, about authority, about his rank in the ecclesiarchy. The Arbites did not respond. They took him. Within the hour, they had arrested 47 senior ecclesiarchy officials, the aesthetic celebrants, the architectural planners. Davin was in that group. I saw him being led through the administrative corridor. He saw me. Our eyes met. I stood up from my desk. An Arbites blocked my path, shockmaul raised. "Remain at your station," he said. I watched Davin being taken through the doors. He looked back once. His expression was not fear. It was incomprehension. The cathedral complex was locked down. Everyone remaining was confined to their duty stations pending interrogation. I sat at my desk for 11 hours. No explanation was provided. At the 22nd hour of lockdown, an interrogator arrived at my station. Not Arbites, inquisitorial staff. A man in black with the inquisitorial rosette visible on his chest. He accessed my terminal and began pulling my files. Attendance records, devotional tithe documentation, personnel files. He worked in silence for 40 minutes. Then he turned to me. "You've processed documentation for this facility for 27 years, he said. "Not a question," I confirmed. "You've attended services regularly," I confirmed. "Describe the services." I described them. The beauty, the music, the transcendent experience of the Emperor's perfection, the sense of connection to the divine through aesthetic devotion. He listened without expression. When I finished, he pulled up an image on my terminal. It was a picked capture of one of Cathedral 17's chapels. I recognized the Chapel of Sublime Surrender from the distinctive carved pillars. The image showed the chapel during a service. Worshippers in various states of devotional ecstasy, the aesthetic celebrants leading them in what I knew was the litany of perfect offering. The incense was visible as thick smoke. The lighting created dramatic shadows. The worshippers' faces were rapturous. "What do you see?" the interrogator asked. "A worship service," I said. "Devoted imperial citizens experiencing the Emperor's glory." He pulled up another image. This one I did not recognize. It showed a different space, darker, more organic in design. Figures in similar states of ecstasy, similar smoke, similar lighting. The aesthetic was remarkably similar to our chapels. "What about this?" he asked. I studied it. "Another chapel. I don't recognize the location." "This," he said, "is a Slaaneshi cult temple. Captured on Vorgand Secundus. 3 million cultists purged. I looked at the image. I looked at the image of our chapel. The similarity was significant. I felt something cold settling in my chest. You worship the Emperor, the interrogator said. The theology references the Emperor. The prayers invoke the Emperor. The doctrine is technically imperial. Do you understand why this is problematic? I did not yet. Our faith is genuine, I said. We worship the God Emperor of mankind. Our devotion is pure. Your devotion, he said, is genuine. I don't question that. But what are you devoted to? You say the Emperor's name. But what are you actually worshipping when you pursue transcendent beauty? When you seek ecstatic sensory experience? When your entire practice centers on pleasure, sensation, perfection, aesthetic excess? The cold in my chest expanded. We worship the Emperor's perfection. You worship perfection, he corrected. Beauty, sensation, experience. You pursue these things in the Emperor's name, yes. But the pursuit itself, what does it serve? I did not answer. I could not. He stood. You've been deceived, all of you. Slowly, over decades. The corruption wasn't inserted. It was cultivated. You started with genuine faith and legitimate theology. But form shapes content. Aesthetics reshape belief. You've spent 27 years pursuing beauty, ecstasy, perfect experience. You call it the Emperor's worship. But the thing that actually feeds on worship like this, the entity that grows stronger when humans pursue sensation and perfection and excessive experience. He paused. That's not the Emperor, you understand. I understood. The understanding arrived not as revelation, but as recognition of something I had somehow known and not known simultaneously. We worshipped the Emperor. We genuinely, sincerely worshipped the Emperor. Every prayer said his name. Every doctrine referenced his glory. But the actual content of our worship, the ecstatic pursuit of beauty, the sensory excess, the transcendent experiences, that served something else, something that did not care what name we said while we fed it. Slaanesh, I said. The word felt wrong in my mouth. I had said it before, only in catechisms of denunciation. Slaanesh, he confirmed, the Emperor of mankind represents duty, sacrifice, the denial of self in service to humanity's survival. Your Cardinal Verentius transformed that into the pursuit of perfection, beauty, and sensory transcendence. He did not intend to. He thought he was strengthening faith. He was. But faith in what? When devotion feels that good, that beautiful, that ecstatic, what is it really serving? What happens now? I asked. My voice was mechanical. The cathedral complex will be purged. The theological corruption is too deep for reformation. The buildings will be demolished. The staff will be interrogated. Those found complicit in deliberate corruption will be executed. Those found to be deceived but salvageable will be relocated and monitored. You? He studied me. You've been here 27 years. You've been steeped in this, but you were staff, not clergy. You may be salvageable. And Davin, the architect, he designed the corruption into the physical structure. Deliberate or not, that makes him complicit. The interrogator paused. He will be executed. The coldness filled me completely. I sat at my desk and felt nothing, because feeling would have broken something that could not be repaired. I had processed devotional records for 27 years. I had logged attendance, donations, baptisms, marriages. I had archived the growth of Cathedral 17 from struggling facility to subsector famous center of worship. I had documented our success with pride. I had archived our corruption, catalogued it, organized it, made it efficient. I helped, I said. Not a question. You processed papers, the interrogator said. That's not the same as designing theology. You'll live. I did not feel like living was a mercy. They held me in an inquisitorial detention facility for 8 months. The interrogations were extensive. They used psychic assessment. a psyker in grey robes who pressed his fingers to my temples and sifted through my memories like files. They verified that I had been deceived, not actively corrupted. That I genuinely believed I was serving the Emperor, that I did not consciously worship chaos. The distinction felt meaningless. I had spent 27 years participating in a system that fed a chaos god. My intentions were irrelevant to the outcome. Dathan was executed in month 4 of my detention. I was informed by an administrative notice. No details, just confirmation of sentence completion. I processed that information the way I had processed tithe records, logged it, archived it, continued functioning. I would allocate time for grief later. I did not. Later never came in a form that made grief possible. Cathedral 17 was demolished in month 6. I was shown picked captures as part of my interrogation. The Inquisitor wanted to assess my reaction. I watched the explosives collapse the towers. The stained glass viewports shattered, the chapel of eternal beauty crushed under rubble, the sculpture of the Emperor in rapture buried in debris. I felt nothing. The psyker confirmed I felt nothing. Shock, he said. Psychological defense mechanism. He said it would pass. It did not pass, it calcified. They released me in month 8 with a new assignment. The Inquisition needed administrators who understood how aesthetic corruption functioned. I was transferred to inquisitorial support staff processing documentation for heresy investigations across the sector. I was assigned a small apartment in a different Hive section. I was placed under permanent monitoring, a servo skull designated Monitor Unit 12 that followed me at prescribed distances and recorded my activities for review. I was told this was for my protection as much as the Imperium's. I was salvageable, but salvaged things required observation. I worked. The new position involved reviewing documentation from suspected corruption sites and identifying patterns. I was, apparently, quite good at this. I could recognize the aesthetic markers now, the language patterns, the theological drift, the way beauty and excess crept into devotional practice. I flagged 17 facilities across the sector in my first 2 years. All were found to have varying degrees of corruption. All were purged. I archived the reports. I did not attend worship services. This was not prohibited. It was expected that someone with my history might need time to rebuild faith. The inquisitorial overseer assigned to my case suggested I might never rebuild it. Some wounds to faith did not heal, he said. I could still serve the Emperor through duty even without belief. Duty was sufficient. Duty was, perhaps, purer than belief. Belief could be corrupted. Duty simply required execution. I executed my duty. I processed corruption reports. I identified patterns. I archived the data. Monitor Unit 12 hovered 3 meters behind me at all times, its optical sensors tracking my movements, its recording equipment logging everything for review. I learned to ignore it. It became background, like ventilation hum or the smell of recycled air. In year 5 of my new assignment, I was sent to review a facility in a different hive. Hive Quartus, lower commercial sector. A small chapel, nothing like Cathedral 17's scale. Reports suggested theological irregularity. Services running long, unusual music, worshipper behavior that concerned local Arbites. I arrived with an inquisitorial team. We observed a service. The chapel was crude compared to what I had known. Simple construction, basic iconography. But the music, there were instruments, strings. The worshippers swayed. The priest's liturgy had been modified to include periods of meditative silence. The incense was scented with something floral. It was early-stage corruption, maybe year 3 or 4 of the pattern. Salvageable, potentially, with correction. The inquisitor leading the assessment asked for my analysis. I provided it. I identified the specific deviations, the theological drift, the aesthetic elements that were creating conditions for corruption. I recommended immediate intervention, replace the clergy, standardize the liturgy, eliminate the sensory enhancements, monitor the congregation. Could we salvage it? The inquisitor asked. I thought about Cathedral 17, about Davin, about 27 years of genuine faith, twisted into something that fed the enemy, while we smiled and called it beautiful. No, I said. Purge it. They purged it, the building was cleansed with fire. The congregation was interrogated. The priest was executed. I archived the report. The Inquisitor commended my decisiveness. Corruption was easier to kill early, he said. I had saved resources, prevented spread, served the Emperor efficiently. I had condemned a building and its worshippers because they reminded me of something I had lost. I understood that. I processed it. I did not stop. There was nothing to do except continue. Year 7. A monastery in the Underhive reported breakthrough in prayer techniques that produced profound devotional experiences. I investigated. The monks had developed sensory deprivation meditations combined with sustained chanting that created altered states of consciousness. They believed they were achieving closer connection to the Emperor. The techniques were working. The monks were deeply committed. Their faith was strong. The aesthetic markers were present. The pattern was forming. I recommended purging. They purged. Year 9. An ecclesiarchy scholar on an agri-world introduced beauty into their educational framework, teaching that the Emperor's perfection could be understood through artistic appreciation. The students were painting, sculpting, studying classical aesthetics. Their faith was growing. Their devotion was passionate. I saw Cathedral 17 in its early stages. I recommended immediate intervention. The Inquisitor questioned whether I was being excessive. This was an educational institution. The corruption was minor. I provided detailed analysis of how Cathedral 17 had started similarly. He authorized the purge. 40 students burned. They died confused, calling out that they loved the Emperor. They did. That was not sufficient protection. Year 12, I stopped counting individual sites. They blurred together. Each investigation was the same pattern at different stages. Each purge was necessary. Each recommendation I made was correct by inquisitorial standards. I was protecting the Imperium from corruption. I was serving the Emperor through duty. I was destroying anything that resembled what I had loved. Monitor Unit 12's presence became something other than surveillance. The servo skull was the only constant in my life. It hovered, it recorded, it accompanied me through investigations, through travel, through the small apartment where I existed between assignments. I spoke to it sometimes. Not conversations, it could not respond beyond basic affirmative sounds, but observations. The pattern matches Cathedral 17, Year 8, I would say while reviewing documentation. Monitor Unit 12 would chirp acknowledgement. I was not speaking to it. I was speaking to the record, to the archive, to the inquisitorial staff who would review the recordings. I was testifying. Year 15. The inquisitor who supervised my case called me to his office. I reported as required. His office was austere, standard inquisitorial aesthetic, no decoration, nothing excessive, pure function. He gestured for me to sit. Your performance has been exemplary, he said. 73 sites flagged, 61 confirmed corrupted, 12 prevented from developing corruption. Your false positive rate is barely 14%. That's exceptional for aesthetic corruption analysis. I acknowledged the information. You've never attempted to attend worship services, he continued. In 15 years. Correct, I said. Do you still consider yourself faithful? I considered the question. I serve the Emperor through my duties. Faith is complicated. You were broken, he said. Not unkindly, statement of fact. Cathedral 17 broke you. What you experienced there, genuine devotion twisted into something obscene. That kind of betrayal doesn't heal. You've redirected that wound into service. It's effective, but it's also destroying you slowly. I did not disagree. There was no point. I'm not removing you from duty, he said. Your skills are too valuable. But I want you to understand what you've become. You're hunting the thing you loved. Every site you flag, every congregation you send to purging. You're killing Cathedral 17 over and over. You're executing Davin repeatedly. You understand. I understood. I had understood for years. Understanding and stopping were different categories. Does it matter, I asked, if I'm effective? To the Imperium? No. To you. He paused. I think it should. I returned to my duties. The conversation changed nothing. There was nothing to change. I was what Cathedral 17 had made me, a processor of devotional corruption, a classifier of aesthetic heresy, an archive of patterns that led faithful believers into damnation. I was good at it because I had been one of them. I knew how it felt from inside. I knew how genuine the faith was, right up until the moment you realized you had been feeding the enemy for decades while smiling. Year 2. A new inquisitor took over my case. The previous one had died, killed during an unrelated investigation. The replacement was younger, more aggressive in her approach to heresy. She reviewed my files and called me in. Your recommendations are excessively cautious, she said. Multiple sites you flagged for purging could have been corrected with proper intervention. The pattern suggests you see Cathedral 17 in every chapel that incorporates music. You're applying trauma, not analysis. I did not respond. She was not entirely wrong. I'm reassigning you, she said. You're being transferred to documentation archival. No more field assessments. You'll process historical records, identify pattern libraries for training materials. You're still valuable, but not in active investigations. I was pulled from fieldwork and placed in an archival facility deep in the inquisitorial complex. The work was pure documentation processing. I reviewed historical heresy cases, extracted pattern data, created reference materials for investigator training. I had returned, essentially, to what I had done at Cathedral 17, processing papers, creating archives. Monitor Unit 12 remained assigned to me. It hovered in my archival workspace, recording as I worked through centuries of corruption documentation. I spent months reading testimonies from other corrupted faithful, other people who had worshipped sincerely while feeding chaos, other cathedrals, other practices, other aesthetic variations on the same pattern. We were not unique. Cathedral 17 was not special. We were one instance in an endless cycle of human faith proving insufficient protection against corruption. I found documentation of a shrine on a feudal world that had incorporated dance into their emperor worship. Over 40 years, the dance became increasingly elaborate, increasingly sensual, increasingly ecstatic. By year 38, the worshippers were performing rituals indistinguishable from Slaanesh excess while genuinely believing they honored the emperor. The Inquisition burned 6,000 faithful. The testimony from the surviving priest was documented. He could not understand what he had done wrong. He had loved the emperor. He had served faithfully. The beauty of the dances had brought his people closer to the divine, he insisted. How was that corruption? I archived his testimony. I understood him perfectly. He had been me, or I had been him. The distinction did not matter. Year 23, I was permitted to attend a worship service. Not required, permitted. The inquisitorial oversight had loosened after years of uneventful archival work. I was no longer considered high risk. If I chose to attempt rebuilding my faith, I would be allowed under monitoring. I attended a service at an inquisitorial chapel. The space was deliberately austere. Stone walls, simple wooden benches, a bare aquila on the wall. No artistic elaboration, just the symbol rendered in iron. The service was standard ministerium pattern, recitation of creed. Basic hymns, unaccompanied by instruments. A brief homily from a priest in plain black robes. The entire service lasted 40 minutes. I sat on the hard bench and felt nothing. The words were correct. The theology was pure. The practice was uncorrupted. It was everything Cathedral 17 had not been. It was safe. It was faithful. It was empty. I did not attend services again. Year 27. 38 years after I had first processed tithe records at Cathedral 17. I was 57 years old. My health was declining, standard aging, nothing dramatic, but I moved slower. saw less clearly, processed information with marginally reduced efficiency. The Inquisition offered retirement. I could take modest residence in a suitable Hive section, receive a small pension, live out remaining years under minimal monitoring. I declined. There was nothing to retire to. I had no connections, no interests outside my work, no family. Davin had been the last person I was close to. That had ended 30 years ago in an execution I never witnessed. I had acquaintances in the inquisitorial staff, people I worked with, but no one I would call if I were dying. No one who would call me. I requested continued assignment to archival duties. The request was granted. I would work until I died or became too impaired to function. Then I would be retired involuntarily. Monitor Unit 12's presence had become something I depended on. The servo skull was the only entity that had accompanied me continuously for the past 33 years. It hovered, it recorded. It was always there. When I worked late in the archives, alone in the silence, I could hear its anti-grav systems humming. The sound was comforting. I was not alone. I was being witnessed. Year 31. I was reviewing documentation from a recent investigation, a cathedral on a forge world that had incorporated machine aesthetic into their emperor worship. The investigation found no corruption. The aesthetic served function, not sensation. The patterns were different from Cathedral 17's trajectory. The cathedral was cleared. I read the clearance report 3 times. I searched for the corruption I knew had to be there. I could not find it. The investigation was thorough. The Inquisitors found genuine, uncorrupted faith, expressed through aesthetic choices that served the local culture's understanding of the divine. Beauty in service of truth, not excess. It was possible then. Aesthetic worship that did not corrupt, form that did not inevitably poison content. Cathedral 17 was not inevitable, except it had happened. Whatever might have been possible, what actually occurred was decades of genuine believers feeding Slaanesh while saying the Emperor's name. Millions of faithful corrupted, thousands executed, a community destroyed. Davin killed for designing beautiful spaces meant to honor the God Emperor. Possibility was irrelevant. Reality was the archive. Year 34. Another investigator requested my consultation on a case. A Hive City ecclesiarchy developing passionate devotional techniques that concerned local authorities. The investigator wanted my assessment before committing resources. I reviewed the documentation. The patterns were there. Early stage, salvageable with intervention, but the trajectory was clear. I recommended full investigation and probable purging. The investigator questioned my recommendation. They're still within doctrinal boundaries, he said. The techniques are unusual but not explicitly heretical. They will be, I said. Give it time. Form shapes content. Aesthetic devotion creates conditions for corruption. If they continue this trajectory, in 10 years they'll be indistinguishable from the early stage Slaaneshi worship. Better to purge now. You're recommending killing potentially innocent faithful based on what they might become? Yes, I said. That's how corruption is stopped. You kill it before it grows. You don't wait for confirmation, because confirmation means it's already spread. The investigator did not take my recommendation. He ordered intervention instead, replacing clergy, standardizing liturgy, monitoring congregation. I archived his decision. 3 years later, the same Hive City required purging anyway. The corruption had survived the intervention and blossomed once restrictions lifted. 8,000 faithful executed. The investigator filed a report acknowledging that early purging would have been more efficient. I archived that report too. Being correct brought no satisfaction. 8,000 people were dead either way. My only contribution was saying, "I told you so," in archived documentation. Year 38. My vision was failing significantly. The Inquisition provided augmetic enhancement. Basic optical replacements, nothing elaborate. I could see again. The world looked slightly different through augmetic eyes. Sharper, colder, more data-focused. Colors were accurate. but felt distant. I could read documentation with perfect clarity. I could not remember what Davin's eyes had looked like. That memory had degraded. The file was corrupted. Monitor Unit 12 was upgraded around the same time. The new model had improved recording capability and extended operational range. It looked different, sleeker, more efficient. The old model had been my companion for 38 years. The new model was functionally superior. I missed the old one. This reaction was irrational. Servo skulls were equipment, not companions. I processed the reaction and discarded it. Year 41. I collapsed at my workstation. Medical assessment indicated cardiac insufficiency, age-related deterioration requiring treatment. The Inquisition could provide augmetic cardiac enhancement, but the procedure had risks at my age. Or I could accept reduced functionality, decreased workload, eventual retirement. I chose the augmetic. There was nothing waiting in retirement except time to think, and thinking served no purpose. The procedure was successful. I recovered with a mechanical heart. The sensation was strange, precise, rhythmic, inhuman. I could feel it operating in my chest. Tick, 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 tick. Perfectly regular, never varying. I did not need to feel my pulse to know I was alive. I could hear it. Always. Year 43. The Inquisitor overseeing my section called me to her office. Different Inquisitor than the one from year 20. This one I had worked with for decades. She was 68. We had aged together in the archives. "You've been in service for 54 years, she said. 43 with the Inquisition. Your productivity remains acceptable, but you're heavily augmented now. Heart, eyes, liver function assisted by mechanical systems. You're becoming more machine than human." "Function continues," I said. "I serve." "Yes, but toward what end? You're archiving corruption documentation for training materials. That work is valuable, but not irreplaceable. You could retire, live quietly, rest." "I have no purpose in rest," I said. "My function is documentation. Remove that, and I am simply a failing biological system maintaining itself for no reason." She studied me. "You died in Cathedral 17. You just haven't stopped processing data yet." I considered this assessment accurate, I said. She did not retire me. I returned to my duties, but her words remained in my archive, accessing themselves periodically. I died in Cathedral 17. The thing that continued was archive function wearing my designation. The work continued because ceasing work meant confronting the reality that I had outlived my own existence by 4 decades. Year 47. Monitor Unit 12 malfunctioned. The servo skull's anti-grav systems failed during routine operation. It fell to the floor of my workspace and cracked its casing. The tech priests retrieved it for repair. They returned it 3 days later. The systems were functional, but something had changed. The hum was different, slightly higher frequency, barely noticeable. I noticed. I filed a report requesting retention of the specific unit despite availability of replacement models. The request was flagged as unusual. An overseer reviewed my file and denied the request. Monitor Unit 12 was reassigned. I was issued a newer model. The new servo skull functioned identically. It hovered at prescribed distance. It recorded my activities. It accompanied me through the archives. It was not the same. I had no logical reason for this assessment. Equipment was equipment, but I had been monitored by the previous unit for 43 years. That skull had been present for every moment of my service since Cathedral 17. Its recordings were the complete archive of my transformation from faithful believer to whatever I currently was. The new skull had no history with me. I was simply another assignment to it. I continued working. The new servo skull hovered. I ignored it, then I spoke to it. Then I began narrating my work to it, same as I had with the previous unit. The skull recorded. The recordings were reviewed. No one commented. Narrating to the monitoring device was considered acceptable behavior. Eccentric, but harmless. Year 50. I was 69 years old and failing. The augmetics were maintaining function, but the biological components were degrading. I moved slowly. I required frequent rest cycles. My efficiency had decreased measurably. The Inquisition strongly suggested retirement. I requested one final assignment before separation from service. The request was granted. I was permitted to review the Cathedral 17 archive one final time before retirement. The complete documentation had been sealed after the initial investigation, accessible only with specific clearance. I had never requested access before. Now, facing separation from the only purpose I had known for 5 decades, I wanted to see the record. They granted me access. I sat in a secure archive chamber with the complete Cathedral 17 file, interrogation records, surveillance data, architectural plans, theological documentation, execution records, everything. I found Davin's interrogation transcript. I read his testimony. He had been confused throughout. He insisted he had designed the spaces for the Emperor's glory. The beauty was intentional. It was meant to inspire devotion. He provided detailed explanations of his design choices, the theological concepts he was trying to express in architecture. He was earnest. He believed. Even when they showed him the evidence of corruption, he could not understand how beauty in service of the Emperor could be heretical. The interrogator had written a note at the end of the transcript. Subject appears to be genuinely faithful, but thoroughly corrupted by form. His intentions were pure. The result was not. Recommend execution. He cannot be made to understand the distinction, which means he cannot be salvaged. Davin had been executed because he loved the Emperor too much to comprehend how that love had been twisted into serving something else. I found my own interrogation record. My testimony was there. Hours of recorded sessions with the psyker, with interrogators, with theological assessors. They had determined I was salvageable because my devotion had been less absolute than Davin's. I had questioned. I had doubted. That capacity for doubt had protected me from complete corruption. Davin's perfect faith had killed him. My insufficient faith had saved me. I read the casualty reports. Cathedral 17 and its associated facilities had served approximately 4 million faithful at the time of the inquisitorial intervention. 3,800,000 were judged corrupted beyond salvation and executed. 200,000 were judged salvageable, with re-education and monitoring. I was in that group. Of those 200,000, only 34,000 successfully completed re-education. The rest were eventually executed as the corruption resurfaced. I had been one of 34,000 survivors out of 4 million believers, 3,966,000 executed, not for rejecting the Emperor, for worshipping him wrong. I closed the archive. I had seen enough. Retirement was processed immediately. I was relocated to small quarters in a lower Hive section. Not dangerous, but not comfortable. Adequate. The monitoring was reduced to weekly check-ins rather than constant surveillance. The servo skull was reassigned. I was alone for the first time in 47 years. The silence was overwhelming. I attempted to occupy myself. I read. I reviewed public documentation. I walked the Hab section corridors during appropriate hours. The augmetic heart ticked in my chest. Tick, 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 tick. Perfectly regular. Never stopping. I existed. 3 months into retirement, I requested permission to write a testimony. The request was reviewed by my inquisitorial overseer and granted with conditions. The testimony would be reviewed before archival. Nothing classified could be included, no details that might compromise ongoing operations. But I could document my experience for the historical record. I began writing, or speaking. The words were recorded by a standard servo unit I was provided for the purpose. I narrated my history. Cathedral 17, the transformation, the beauty. Davin, the Inquisition, the arrests, the executions. The decades of archival work, the pattern repeated across hundreds of sites, the corruption that looked like faith until you understood what it was feeding. I spoke for hours, days, weeks. The servo unit recorded everything. I testified. This document is that testimony. I am 71 years old. I have served the Imperium for 56 years. 27 in faithful worship of the Emperor that was actually worship of Slaanesh, and 29 in service to the Inquisition hunting the corruption I had once embodied. I am more augmetic than human now. Mechanical heart, optical implants, liver support systems, joint replacements. The machine continues the biological function past its natural termination. I do not know if I am faithful. I serve the Emperor through duty, but I have not believed in decades. Belief was corrupted out of me in Cathedral 17. What remains is function. I process. I archive. I document. I think about David more often now. Time has not faded that loss. It has clarified it. He died believing he had served the Emperor faithfully. His last thoughts were probably confusion, wondering what he had done wrong. I survived by being less faithful, less committed, less capable of perfect devotion. My imperfection saved me. His perfection killed him. The Imperium requires faith. But faith must be carefully constrained. Perfect faith becomes excess. Passionate devotion becomes corruption. Beauty in service of the divine becomes beauty as divine. The line is thin. Cathedral 17 proved how thin. We worshipped the Emperor. We said his name in every prayer. We believed with absolute sincerity that we served him, and we were wrong. The thing that fed on our worship was not the God Emperor of mankind. It was something else entirely, something that grew fat on our beauty and our ecstasy and our passionate pursuit of perfection. We were corrupted through aesthetics, through form-shaping content, until the content transformed completely, while the form remained recognizable. We were Slaanesh worshippers who thought we were Imperial faithful. Millions of us, for decades. That is what I learned in Cathedral 17, and spent 47 years afterward proving repeatedly. Faith alone does not protect you. Sincerity alone does not save you. The Imperium's machinery will consume you whether you serve perfectly or serve poorly. The only difference is how you are consumed, as faithful martyr or as corrupted heretic. I was consumed as corrupted heretic, who was salvageable enough to be repurposed into corruption hunter. I spent decades killing what I had been. I was efficient. I was effective. I served the Emperor through mechanical duty after faith failed. The augmatic heart ticks in my chest. Tick, 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 tick. It will continue ticking until the biological systems fail completely. Then it will tick in a corpse until someone turns it off. Function continues past purpose. The machine does not know when to stop. I am that machine. I do not know when to stop. This is my testimony. I witnessed the Imperium consume 4 million faithful believers in the name of protecting humanity from corruption. I was one of 34,000 survivors. I helped consume thousands more over the following decades. The pattern continues. The cycle perpetuates. Faith corrupts. Devotion destroys. Beauty betrays. The Imperium endures by burning its most passionate believers. I served the Emperor in Cathedral 17 through worship that fed his enemy. I served the Emperor in the Inquisition by destroying others who did the same. Both times I was faithful. Both times I did what I believed was right. Both times I was part of the machine that consumes humanity to preserve humanity. The distinction between those two services is theological. The outcome is the same. The Imperium continues. I processed data for it. That was my function. That was my existence. I am finished testifying now. The augmetic heart ticks. Tick, 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 tick. The machine continues. The record is complete.